The words hit Helen Slater like a slap across the face, right there in the middle of Caldwell's general store, with half the town watching and the December wind rattling the glass pane in the window behind her. "The winters out here will break you," Nathan Morgan said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite cruelty and not quite kindness, something caught in between that made it worse than either. He stood with his back half turned to her, his hat in his hands, his jaw set like poured iron. "I've seen women come out here full of conviction and leave by spring on a wagon heading east, crying the whole way home. The land doesn't care about your determination, Helen. It doesn't care about anything." She had been in Caldwell, Kansas for exactly 4 days. She had crossed half a continent by rail and another 40 miles by stagecoach to stand in this store, in this town, in front of this particular man who looked at her like she was already a failure he hadn't the patience to witness. She had left everything behind her: a cramped boarding house in Philadelphia, a job sewing buttons on coats until her fingers bled, a mother who had looked at her the morning she left and said nothing at all, which was somehow the most devastating thing of all the devastating things her mother had ever done. Helen set down the bag of flour she had been holding and turned to face Nathan Morgan fully, and every eye in that store watched her do it. "The winters will test me," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her was shaking. "And that is fine. I have already been tested, and I passed." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever stood inside. Nathan looked at her, then really looked at her, the way he had been carefully avoiding since she stepped off the stagecoach 4 days ago. His eyes were a complicated shade of gray-green, like the sky before a storm decides what it wants to do with itself, and what she saw in them was not what she expected. It was not dismissal. It was not contempt. It was something she could not name yet, something that lived right at the edge of fear, and she filed it away in the back of her mind without knowing why. He put his hat on his head, nodded once, and walked out of the store. Half the town exhaled, and Helen Slater stood in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, in the last days of autumn 1879, and decided right then that she was going to be absolutely fine. She had not, of course, always known she would be fine. The story of how Helen Slater came to be standing in that general store on that particular morning was not a short one, and it was not a tidy one, and it did not begin with hope. It began, as so many things in Helen's life began, with a letter. She had been 24 years old, working in the button factory on the east side of Philadelphia, when her friend Clara had pressed the newspaper clipping into her hands one gray Tuesday morning. It was an advertisement. Brides wanted in the West. Honest men seeking honest women. Correspondent preferred. Write to the postmaster of Caldwell, Kansas. Clara had meant it as a joke, or something close to a joke, the kind of thing you wave in front of a friend when you want to make her laugh on a day when laughing feels impossible. Helen had not laughed. She had folded the clipping into the pocket of her apron and carried it home, and unfolded it at the kitchen table of the boarding house by the light of a single tallow candle, and she had read it 3 times. She was not romantic by nature, or at least that was what she told herself. She was practical. She had been practical since she was 9 years old and her father walked out the front door of their house in Maryland and did not come back, leaving her mother with 3 children, a stack of unpaid bills, and a disposition that curdled steadily over the following years into something cold and hard and quietly vicious. Helen had been the oldest. Helen had learned early that practicality was the only armor that held, but she had also been alone for a long time. Not alone in the way that means no people around. There were always people at the factory, always women crammed into the boarding house, always the noise and press of the city. Alone in the way that means something essential in you goes untouched, year after year, until you start to wonder if it is even there anymore. She had written the letter. She had not expected a response, or not exactly. She had expected perhaps a form letter, something generic and impersonal, the kind of thing that gets sent to 20 women at once. Instead, what she received 3 weeks later was a handwritten letter on rough paper, in handwriting that was careful but unpracticed, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who did not write often but who was trying. His name was Nathan Morgan. He was 30 years old. He had come to Kansas 6 years ago from Tennessee and had built a cattle ranch on the eastern edge of Comanche County. He was not a poetic man, he said, and he would not pretend to be one. He needed a wife because running a ranch alone was its own kind of slow drowning, and because he believed, though he had not always, that a person ought not to be alone. He had 140 acres and a house that was not finished and a herd that was growing. He was honest. He had made mistakes in his life that he did not intend to repeat. He was looking for a woman of character, not beauty, though he added with what she could almost feel was awkwardness that he did not mean to suggest he was indifferent to beauty, only that character mattered more. Helen had read that letter 5 times. Then she had written back. They had written to each other for 7 months. 7 months of letters, and in those letters something had happened that Helen had not anticipated and had tried, several times, to talk herself out of. She had come to know him. Not perfectly, not completely. He was a private man, and his letters revealed him in layers slowly, like peeling back the bark of a tree to find the living wood underneath. But she had learned that he had lost his younger brother to a fever when he was 17, and that it had never fully left him. She had learned that he read when he could, which was not often, and that he preferred history to fiction because fiction, he said, played too loose with the truth. She had learned that he was funny in the dry, deadpan way of men who had survived hard things, the kind of humor that comes out sideways when you are not expecting it. And she had told him things too. She had told him about her father. She had told him about the factory and the buttons and the way her fingers looked at the end of a 12-hour day. She had told him about her mother's silence and how it was worse than shouting. She had not told him everything. There were things she kept back, things that lived in the darkest part of her history that she was not ready to put into words on paper to a man she had never met. But she had told him enough to feel, by the time she boarded the train in Philadelphia, that she was going to someone she knew. She had not expected the reality of him to hit her so hard. Nathan Morgan in person was nothing like she had imagined, and also somehow exactly what she had imagined, which was a contradiction she had no immediate explanation for. He was taller than she had pictured, with broad shoulders and hands that had done real work for years, roughened and capable. His face was not handsome in any conventional way. It was too angular, too weathered, the face of a man who had spent years under the Kansas sun. But there was something compelling about it, something in the set of his jaw and the complicated color of his eyes, and the way his mouth did a thing at the corners when he was trying not to show what he was thinking. But he had been cold to her. From the moment she stepped off the stagecoach and he met her in the street, and she had watched him look at her and something shift behind his eyes. He had been polite and distant and armored in a way that his letters had never been. He had shown her the ranch with the efficiency of a man showing a prospective buyer a piece of property, not a man welcoming a woman he had corresponded with for 7 months. He had explained the practical arrangements. She would have her own room. They would be married before the week was out, as was the agreement. She would have time to settle before winter fully arrived. He had not asked her a single personal question. She had tried twice to bridge the distance. She had brought up something he had written in a letter, something small, a comment about a particular stretch of creek on his land that he had described as beautiful in autumn, and she had said she would like to see it. He had said there was not time at the moment and changed the subject. She had tried once more, referencing something he had said about his brother, gently, carefully. He had gone entirely still for a moment and then excused himself and gone out to the barn. It was the general store confrontation, 4 days in, that cracked something open. She did not know it yet. She would not know it for a while. But that moment, when she had looked at Nathan Morgan and refused to be dismissed, when she had stood her ground with her chin up and the whole town watching, had done something to him that he would spend the next several weeks trying to undo. She found out about the dark past 3 days after the scene in the store. She found out from Mabel Cook, who ran the boarding house in town and who had known Nathan since he arrived in Kansas, and who possessed, Helen quickly discovered, an almost alarming inability to keep a secret when the opportunity to share information presented itself. Helen had gone into town to post a letter to Clara and had stopped at the boarding house for a cup of coffee because the morning was bitter and the walk was long, and Mabel had sat across from her at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug and said, in the manner of someone who has been waiting to say a thing for some time, "Did he tell you about Catherine?" Helen set her coffee down. "No," she said. Mabel's expression was a mixture of concern and the particular satisfaction of the person who knows a thing that another person does not. "I didn't think he would," she said. "Nathan doesn't talk about it, won't talk about it. But you're about to marry the man, and I think you ought to know." Catherine Ames had come to Caldwell in the spring of 1876, 3 years ago. She had come from Missouri, the daughter of a merchant, and she had been bright and lovely and full of laughter, by all accounts. She and Nathan had met when she came out to the territory with her father to look at land, and whatever happened between them had happened fast. They had announced an engagement within 2 months. They had set a wedding date for October of that year. In August of 1876, Catherine Ames had packed her belongings, told no one she was going, and taken the stagecoach east. She had left a letter for Nathan. Mabel did not know what it said, and Nathan had never told anyone. What everyone knew was that he had read it and then gone out and saddled his horse and ridden out onto the plains and not come back for 3 days, and when he came back he had been a different person than the one who rode out. Not harder exactly, more sealed, more locked from the inside. "He wrote to you, didn't he?" Mabel said. "Through the post. He's been writing to someone out east. I heard he was looking for a wife again, and I thought, well," she looked at Helen carefully. "He's a good man, Helen, I want you to know that. Whatever happened with Catherine, it wasn't a failing of character. She was the wrong woman for this life. Some people can't be made for a place just by wanting to be made for it." Helen thought about that on the long, cold walk back to the ranch. She thought about Nathan's coldness and his distance and the particular way he had looked at her when she stepped off the stagecoach, that shift behind his eyes that she had not been able to read. She thought she understood it now. He was waiting for her to leave. He had already decided, somewhere deep and defended, that she would leave. All of his courtesy and practicality and emotional distance was the behavior of a man who had built walls specifically designed to make an exit easier when it came. And she thought, as she turned off the road and onto the track that led to the ranch house, that she had 2 choices. She could be hurt by the secret of Catherine Ames and the fact that he had not told her, or she could understand it. She chose to understand it, but understanding it did not mean she was going to let it stand unchallenged. Nathan was in the barn when she got back, working with a dark roan horse that had thrown a shoe. She stood in the barn doorway with the cold coming in behind her and said, "I know about Catherine." He went very still. He did not look up immediately. He kept his hand on the horse's flank, steadying it, and she could see the muscles in his jaw tighten from where she stood. When he finally turned, his face was flat and controlled in the way of a man who has practiced being flat and controlled for a very long time. "Mabel," he said, "it was not a question." "She cares about you," Helen said. "She was worried I'd be caught off guard." "I was going to tell you," he said. "Were you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I intended to," he said, and it was honest enough that she accepted it. "I am not Catherine Ames," Helen said. "I am not here because Kansas seems like an adventure. I am not here because I thought the West would be romantic and exciting. I am here because I made a decision with everything I had, and I do not make decisions I don't intend to stand behind. But I cannot build something with a person who is already waiting for me to fail." Nathan turned fully toward her then, and something in his face did the complicated thing she had seen in the store, that thing at the edge of fear, that almost recognition. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, quietly, "I don't know how to be sure of anything anymore." "That's honest," Helen said. "I can work with honest." She went inside and made dinner, and that night, for the first time since she had arrived, Nathan Morgan sat at the table across from her and said something that was not purely practical. He said, "Tell me about Philadelphia." And she told him. Not everything, not yet. But she told him about the factory and Clara and the boarding house and the candle and the advertisement, and she watched his face as she talked, watched the sealed thing behind his eyes begin, very slightly, to crack. They were married 5 days later, on a Thursday, in the small church on the main street of Caldwell. The ceremony was brief and without ceremony, the Reverend reading the words, Helen in her best dress, which was blue, and not white because white had never been practical, Nathan in a clean shirt with his hair combed back. There was no congregation except Mabel Cook, and a cattle rancher named Pete Driscoll who had ridden in to witness, and who shook Nathan's hand afterward with the solemn approval of an older man watching a younger one do the right thing. Outside the church, in the cold November air with the trees bare and the sky white as bone, Nathan looked at her and said, "I want to try, Helen. I want you to know that." "So do I," she said. The early days of the marriage were careful. They were two people walking very precisely around each other, learning the geography of shared space. Nathan rose before dawn and was in the barn or on horseback before she was fully awake, and he came back at midday for a meal and in the evening for supper, and then worked for another hour or two by lamplight on his accounts or whatever needed mending. He was not unkind. He was not absent. But he was careful, and she was careful back, and for a time it felt like a dance where neither person was willing to commit to the first step. Helen threw herself into the ranch. She had not come here to be idle. She had never been idle in her life and did not intend to start, and there was more than enough to do. The house was, as he had told her, not finished. The back room was still raw lumber. The kitchen had a stove that worked but bled smoke if the wind came from the north. The root cellar needed reorganizing before winter set in. She worked every day until her hands ached again, and they were a different kind of aching from the button factory. This was the ache of building something real. She found, to her own surprise, that she loved the land. She had expected to tolerate it. She had expected to find it beautiful in the abstract way that things are beautiful when you are looking at them through a window. She had not expected to fall in love with the particular quality of light in the late afternoon over the flat plains, the way the grass moved in the wind like water, the vast and unforgiving sky. She had not expected to feel, standing outside the ranch house at dusk watching the last of the sun go down, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wrote to Clara about it, and Clara wrote back that she was glad but also that she was worried, because the way Helen described it sounded like falling in love, and Clara knew how Helen felt about falling in love, which was the way she felt about most forms of vulnerability, with deep suspicion and a contingency plan ready. The first real conversation happened in the second week of December. The weather had turned serious overnight, the kind of cold that is not just an absence of warmth but a physical presence, a thing with weight and intent. Nathan had come in from the barn stamping snow off his boots, and Helen had a pot of beef stew on the stove and coffee made, and they sat down together and ate in the way they had been eating, in comfortable enough silence, and then Nathan said, without looking up from his bowl, "You didn't grow up comfortable." It was not a question. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I could tell," he said. "Not from anything you said, from the way you work. Comfortable people work differently." He paused. "My family didn't have much either. Tennessee, after the war, we had some rough years." The Civil War had ended 14 years ago in 1865, which meant Nathan would have been 15 or 16 when it ended, old enough to remember, old enough to have been shaped by it. "Did your family fight?" she asked. "My father did," he said. "My older brother too. My father came back. My brother didn't." He said it flatly, with the flatness of something that has been said so many times internally that the saying of it aloud has lost its edge. Then Thomas, my younger brother, died of fever when I was 17, couple years after the war, so he picked up his coffee. It was just me and my mother for a while, and then she remarried and I came west. I'm sorry, Helen said. About your brothers. He nodded once the way he had that first day in the store, but this time it felt like acknowledgement rather than dismissal. The letter, she said carefully, the one you mentioned in our correspondence, where you said you believed a person ought not to be alone. Was that something you always thought, or did you come to it? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls of the house, and the lamp on the table threw warm light across the rough wood. I came to it, he said, the hard way, after Catherine left. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I spent about a year being fine with being alone, telling myself it was better. That people leave, and if you don't let them close enough, they can't take anything with them when they go. He paused. And then one night in the middle of February, about 2 years ago, the temperature dropped to something ungodly, and a section of fence came down in the night, and I spent 6 hours in the dark by myself fixing it. And when I came back in and there was nobody here, no light on, nobody at the stove, nobody to tell that it was fixed, I felt the worst kind of emptiness I have ever felt in my life. Another pause longer. And I thought Thomas would say I'm being a fool. Thomas would say that building walls is only useful if you're actually inside something worth protecting. Helen looked at him. Her throat was tight in a way she had not expected. She thought of her own long loneliness, her own careful armoring, and she thought that they had come to this table from the same direction through different country. Thomas sounds like he was wise, she said. He was 11, Nathan said, and his mouth did the thing at the corners, the almost smile that appeared sideways. But yes, he was wise. She laughed, a small, surprised sound. He looked up at her when she laughed, and the almost smile grew by a fraction. It was not much, but it was the first real warmth between them, and she felt it settle into her chest like the heat from the stove, slow and steadying. December deepened, and with it came the full weight of the Kansas winter, and Nathan had not been wrong. It was brutal. The temperature fell to levels that Helen had never experienced even in Philadelphia, a cold that got into the bones and stayed there, a cold that made every task outside into a small battle. She learned quickly. She learned how to bank the stove at night to keep the fire from dying, how to dress for outside work in layers that might have seemed absurd back east but were simple necessity here. She learned which chores could not wait for better weather and which ones could, and she learned the particular discipline of not complaining about things that could not be changed. There was one morning, about 3 weeks after their first real conversation, when everything tested her at once. She had gone out to fetch water from the well before Nathan was up, because she wanted the coffee ready when he came in, and the well pump had frozen and she had spent 20 minutes working it free. And by the time she got back inside, her hands were so cold she could barely hold the pail, and she had sloshed water on herself and was wet and freezing, and the stove had burned low in the night, and the kitchen was barely warmer than outside. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, her teeth chattering, her wet clothes cold against her skin, and she thought, this is the test. This exact moment right here. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the particular winter morning 7 years ago, when she had been 17 and her mother had thrown her out of the house for a day, and a night as punishment for something Helen could no longer even remember. And she had sat in a doorway on Calvert Street in the January cold with her coat pulled tight around her. And she had thought, not with despair but with a cold and absolute clarity, that she was going to survive this and everything that came after it. She had survived it. She rebuilt the fire in the stove. She changed her clothes. She made the coffee. When Nathan came in from the barn, his eyebrows went up slightly at the controlled efficiency of it all, the warm kitchen, the coffee on, her expression perfectly composed. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "The pump froze. I got it working. You might want to insulate it better before next week." He looked at her for a moment with that complicated expression she was beginning to learn. "I'll do that," he said. She poured his coffee and he sat down and she sat across from him, and they drank coffee together in the morning warmth of the kitchen, and outside the wind was doing its worst and neither of them said anything for a while, and Helen thought that this exact quiet thing was what she had not known she needed. The trap she had not seen coming sprang in the middle of January. His name was Frank Darby, and he rode onto the Morgan Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when Nathan was out checking the herd in the far pasture and would not be back until after dark. Helen was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she went to the window and saw a man she did not know, a compact man in a heavy coat, sitting a gray horse in the yard and looking at the house with the particular assessment of a man who is looking at property. She went to the door and opened it and said from the porch, "Can I help you?" Darby tipped his hat and smiled, and the smile was the kind of smile that does not start in the eyes. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "I'm Frank Darby. I have some business with your husband." "He's not here," she said. "I expect him back after dark." "I can wait," Darby said, easily, still smiling. He dismounted without being invited and tied his horse to the post by the barn, and something in Helen's stomach tightened. She had learned enough, in the months of correspondence with Nathan and in the weeks of living in Caldwell County, to know something about Frank Darby without being told. She had heard the name once from Pete Driscoll, who had mentioned in passing that there was a man who had been making offers on land in the county, buying up parcels, and that some of those offers had been made in ways that were less than entirely voluntary. She had heard it, filed it, and not asked Nathan about it because it had seemed peripheral. It did not seem peripheral now. She let Darby wait in the yard. She did not invite him in, and she went to the back room and retrieved Nathan's second rifle from the rack on the wall, which she had learned to shoot with reasonable accuracy over the past month because Nathan had insisted on it, saying that a woman alone on a ranch who could not use a firearm was putting herself in danger by her own hand. She brought the rifle back to the kitchen and set it against the wall by the door where she could reach it, and then she went back to her cooking and waited. Nathan came back an hour after dark, later than she had expected, and Darby was still in the yard, his horse's breath making clouds in the freezing air. She heard them talk, their voices low at first, then Nathan's voice going hard and flat in the way it went when he was containing something, and then they came inside. Darby wanted the eastern 40 acres. He had a paper with an offer written on it, a paper he put on the table in Nathan's kitchen while his eyes moved over the house, and its contents in the way of a man who is assessing what he can take. The offer was not reasonable. It was the kind of offer that is made by a man who believes the person he is making it to does not have the leverage to refuse. Helen set a cup of coffee in front of Darby without being asked, and then she sat down at the table without being asked, and Darby looked at her with a flicker of the contained irritation of a man who expected to be having this conversation alone. "The eastern 40 backs up to the creek," Nathan said. He had not touched the paper. "That's my water access for summer grazing." "I'm aware," Darby said. "That's why I want it. Then you know why I won't sell." Darby picked up his coffee and drank it in the careful, patient way of a man who is accustomed to waiting out resistance. "Morgan," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you. I've got 6 parcels in this county already. I'll have 14 by spring. The territory is moving, the railroad spur is coming north, and the land on this side of the river is going to triple in value when it does. I'm offering you cash money now so you can buy elsewhere with the profit. I'm doing you a favor." "You're doing yourself a favor," Nathan said. "Both things can be true." Helen looked at the paper on the table. She looked at Darby's face, the smile still there, but thinner now, the patience with a colder thing beneath it. She thought about the hidden motive in the offer, the trap in the generosity, and she thought about what losing the eastern 40 would mean for the ranch and for Nathan and for the life she was building here. "Mr. Darby," she said, and both men looked at her. "Do you have any legal claim on this land?" Darby blinked once, recalibrating. "No," he said. "I'm making a purchase offer." "Which my husband has declined," she said. "So you've delivered your offer and received your answer. I think that concludes your business here." Darby looked at her for a moment with the flat assessment of a man deciding how seriously to take an obstacle. Then he smiled again, the eyes still cold, and stood. "Mrs. Morgan," he said with exaggerated courtesy. He picked up the paper from the table, folded it, and tucked it back into his coat. "I expect we'll speak again." He nodded to Nathan. "Morgan." He went out. They heard his horse leave the yard, and then the sound of hooves faded into the frozen dark. Nathan stood at the table looking at the door. Helen got up and took Darby's cup and washed it out in the basin because her hands needed something to do. "He's going to come back," Nathan said. "Probably," Helen said, "or he'll try another way." Nathan turned and looked at her. She was still at the basin, her back half to him, and he was looking at her in a way she could feel without seeing. "You knew to send him out," he said. "He had his answer," she said. "Not everyone would have done that. Not everyone would have just sat down and said what needed saying." She turned to look at him. He was still at the table, his hands at his sides, looking at her with something open and undefended in his face that she had not seen before, and it was that openness that did something to her she had not been ready for. "Nathan," she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended, and she saw him notice it. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she was still holding the tin cup, and he took it from her hands and set it on the counter without looking at it, and then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them, which had been maintained with such careful effort for 7 weeks, closed to nothing. He kissed her with a gentleness she had not expected from him, tentative and then steadying, his hand coming up to the side of her face, and she thought, "There you are. There is the person who wrote those letters." They stood in the warm kitchen while the wind drove ice crystals against the window, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and certain, and she thought that this was exactly the kind of thing she had taught herself not to need, and that she had been wrong to teach herself that. He pulled back and looked at her, and there was something almost frightened in his expression, the way a man looks when he has done something he cannot take back and is trying to decide if that terrifies him or relieves him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, because she knew that was what he needed to hear, and because it was absolutely true. He exhaled slowly and pulled her back in, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, and it was the first time in a very long time that she had let herself be held by anything at all. The Frank Darby problem did not go away, because men like Frank Darby never simply accept a no and move on. In late January, Helen discovered through Mabel Cook, who had discovered it through her husband who served on the county commission, that Darby had filed a water rights dispute against the Morgan Ranch. He was claiming an error in the original land survey that would put the creek and Nathan's water access outside the legal boundary of his property. It was a manufactured claim, designed to pressure a settlement, but it had legal teeth regardless of its origins. Nathan rode into Caldwell to consult with the only lawyer in the county, a man named Goodwin who had a small office next to the bank and whose services were in consistently high demand for exactly this kind of dispute. Helen went with him. She had been going into town with Nathan more often in these weeks, not because she needed escorting, but because they had, without quite deciding to, started choosing each other's company. And she sat in Goodwin's dusty office and listened while the lawyer explained the situation, and she asked 3 questions that Goodwin answered with the slightly startled expression of a man who had not expected the wife to be the sharper of the two. And then she said, "The original survey was done in 1873. Which is when Nathan filed his land claim. Are those survey records held at the Territorial Land Office?" "They are," Goodwin said. "Then we request the original records," Helen said, "and we challenge the accuracy of Darby's survey against them. If the original survey establishes the creek boundary correctly, his dispute has no foundation." Goodwin looked at her. Then he looked at Nathan. Nathan was looking at his wife with an expression that Mabel Cook would later describe, on the authority of hearing it from Nathan himself, as the moment he knew. The original survey records supported Nathan's claim. It took 6 weeks and cost money they could not easily spare, But by the first week of March 1880, the water rights dispute was dismissed, and Frank Darby, who had apparently decided that the Morgan Ranch was more trouble than its value, moved his attention to other parcels in the county. March arrived with a violence of weather that made even Helen pause, a late blizzard that came in from the northwest and kept them housebound for 3 days. The cattle survived because Nathan and Helen worked together through the first night of it, going back and forth to the barn, checking the herd, keeping the animals sheltered. They came back in after midnight, crusted with snow, exhausted and cold, and Nathan built the fire back up while Helen made what she called an emergency meal, which was dried beans and the last of the salt pork and bread she had made the day before, and they ate it at 2 in the morning wrapped in blankets at the kitchen table. "This," Nathan said, gesturing vaguely with his spoon, "is what I meant when I said the winters would test you." Helen looked at him over her bowl. "And what did I say?" His mouth did the sideways thing. "You said you'd already been tested." "And I had," she said. "I just hadn't been tested alongside anyone before." The warmth in his eyes at that unguarded, immediate, was something she stored away in the part of herself that she was slowly, carefully beginning to let other things into. On the third day of the blizzard, trapped inside with the wind making the house shudder and the lamp burning low because they were careful with oil, Nathan told her about Catherine. Not because she asked, because he needed to. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he told her the whole thing. How he had been before Catherine, a different person than he was now, more open, more hopeful, less defended. How he had built the house with the expectation of sharing it. How the morning he had woken up to find her room empty, and the letter on the kitchen table had felt like a structural failure, as though the floor of the world had given way. How the letter had said that she loved him but that she was not built for this life, that the loneliness of the ranch was a kind of slow suffocation she could not endure, that she needed the life she had come from and she was sorry. "The worst part wasn't that she left," he said, staring at the cold coffee. "The worst part was that I had known, somewhere underneath, that she was unhappy, that the land was working on her wrong. And I had told myself it would change. I told myself she would adapt." He paused. "I didn't want to see what was true, and not seeing it meant I didn't help her when I could have, and she had to leave on her own to get out of something that was wrong for her." Helen thought about this. She thought about the complexity of it, not just the wound of abandonment but the guilt of having contributed to it by willful blindness, the particular anguish of failing someone while also being failed by them. "You were 27, she said, "and you were hoping. Hoping is not a moral failing. Blindness is," he said. "Nathan," she reached across the table and put her hand on his. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face. "You are not blind now, and neither am I, and we are not the same people as whatever cautionary tale you have been carrying around." He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, the blizzard continued its rampage, indifferent to everything. "I know that," he said. "I know you are not her. But for the first weeks after you arrived, I kept waiting to see it in your eyes. That particular look when the land is working on someone wrong. I kept waiting for you to realize that you had made a mistake." "And did you see it?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I saw the opposite." She squeezed his hand. "What did you see?" "Someone who was exactly where she wanted to be," he said quietly. "Someone who was becoming part of it. Someone who looked at the sky the same way I've been looking at it since I came here." He paused. "I saw someone I was starting to love, and that scared me more than seeing someone who wanted to leave." Helen's chest was full of something she did not immediately have words for. She thought of all the things she had guarded, all the walls she had built from 9 years old onward, the armor and the practicality and the contingency plans, and she thought that she had been building those things to survive the world as she had found it, and that the world she had found here was different enough that the armor was no longer entirely necessary. "Nathan," she said. "Yes, I am starting to love you too, and I am much more frightened of being a coward about it than of the thing itself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles just briefly, and then held it against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat under her palm, that same fast and certain rhythm. "Then neither of us is being a coward," he said. Spring came to Kansas with a reckless, almost aggressive beauty, as though the land was overcompensating for the violence of the winter. The grass came in green and extravagant. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property ran loud and cold with snowmelt. The sky became the particular impossible blue of prairie spring, the kind of blue that makes people understand immediately why poets go on about it. Helen stood at the edge of the south field one morning in April with Nathan beside her, both of them looking at the cattle moving through the new grass, and she thought about the letter he had written. The first letter, the cautious and unpracticed letter that had said, "I believe a person ought not to be alone." She thought about how long a road there had been between that letter and this moment. She thought about all the tested things between them, the cold and the isolation and the Frank Darby trap and the long, careful work of learning to trust each other. And she thought that what they had built together was stronger for all of it, not despite the tests, because of them. "Then," he said. He was watching a young calf that had wandered away from its mother and was now looking puzzled about it. "I want to write to my mother." He turned and looked at her. She had told him about her mother over the winter, not everything, but enough. He knew about the silence and the coldness and the years of small cruelties and the morning she had left Philadelphia and her mother had said nothing. "All right," he said carefully. "I don't want to need her approval," Helen said. "I stopped needing that a long time ago. But I think she ought to know I'm alive and that I am well. Whatever she does with the information is her business." She paused. "And I think I want to tell her that I am happy, because she always seemed to believe happiness was not something I was going to find, and I would like her to know that she was wrong." Nathan smiled at that, a real smile, not the sideways near smile, a full one, and it did something extraordinary to his face. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that evening. She kept it simple. She told her mother where she was and that she was married and that the ranch was real and good and that the life she had built here was the life she wanted. She told her mother that she did not expect a response and that she would not be hurt by the absence of one. She signed it, "Your daughter, Helen." She sent it from Caldwell the next week. She did not hear back for 3 months. When she did, the letter was brief and written in her mother's tight, contained handwriting, and it said, "I am glad you are well. The factory closed this spring. I am staying with your sister Margaret. I hope your husband is a decent man." It was not an apology. It was not warmth. But it was a response, and Helen held it in her hands for a moment and thought that it was the most her mother had ever been capable of giving, and that accepting people for what they could offer rather than resenting them for what they could not was one of the things the West had quietly taught her. She showed the letter to Nathan. He read it and handed it back and said, "She asked if I was a decent man." "She did," Helen said. "And what do you think?" he said. Helen looked at him, this man she had come to know through paper and winter and honesty and time, who had told her the truth about himself, including the hard parts, who had held her hand in the dark and built fires in the cold and sat across a table from her in the small hours and been willing to be known. This man who had kissed her first in a kitchen and held her like she was something valuable, and looked at her across the south field in the spring light with that uncomplicated brightness in his eyes that was new, and that she intended to protect. "I think you are the most decent man I have ever known," she said. He pulled her close and kissed her in the doorway of the ranch house with the evening coming in warm and golden across the plains, and she laughed against his mouth because she was happy, genuinely and fully happy in a way she had not known was coming and could not have planned for. Summer on the ranch was the busiest season, the season that determined everything. The cattle drove to Caldwell in August, for the market brought in the cash that covered expenses for the year, and Nathan had spent the late spring buying 2 additional head to add to the herd, a calculated risk that Helen had helped him think through over the kitchen table, with the accounts laid out between them. She had a head for figures. The button factory had required careful attention to volume and count, and the boarding house had taught her how to manage a household economy with very little margin. And Nathan had found, early in their partnership, that thinking through the finances together produced better decisions than either of them made alone. She rode with him part of the way to Caldwell for the drive. She had learned to ride over the summer, with Nathan's patient and occasionally exasperated instruction. She had fallen off twice, neither time badly, and she was not yet skilled, but she was competent, which was all she had ever aimed to be. She rode out with him in the early morning and turned back at the county road and watched him go, the herd moving in a great slow wave ahead of him and Pete Driscoll in his hands, the dust rising in the August heat. She stood on the county road and watched until they were out of sight, and then she turned her horse back toward the ranch. She had by this time been in Kansas for nearly a year. She had survived the winter that Nathan had promised would test her and had found, true to her word, that she had already been tested and passed. She had built a life in this place from nothing, from scratch, from the blank page of a newspaper advertisement, and the courage it takes to write to a stranger and mean it. What she had not built, what she had quietly noticed without quite letting herself think about it directly, was a family. She told Nathan the evening he came back from the drive in September, with the accounts looking good and the risk of the additional head having paid off and the particular ease in his whole body that came with a successful season's work. They were at supper, the lamp on, the windows dark with early autumn night, and she said, carefully, "Nathan, I think I'm going to have a baby." He looked up from his plate. She watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, a sequence of things in quick succession, surprise and then something that might have been fear for half a second, and then something she could only call undone, completely undone, like a man seeing something he had given up on. "Helen," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I'm not certain yet," she said, "but I am fairly certain." He was around the table in a moment, pulling her up from her chair, holding her face in both hands, looking at her with those gray-green eyes that she had learned so well and that were bright now with something that was not anything she had a word for yet except that it was the best thing she had ever seen. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said, laughing a little at his urgency. "I am not fragile, Nathan." "I know," he said. "I know you are not fragile." "I know that better than anyone." He kissed her forehead. "I just want to be sure." "I am sure," she said. He held her then, his arms around her in the warm kitchen, and she felt him exhale against her hair, slow and deep, the way he exhaled when something that had been holding taut inside him finally released. She carried the pregnancy through the autumn and the winter of 1880 into 1881 was, by the testimony of everyone in Caldwell County, one of the hardest on record. The blizzards came early and stayed late. There were weeks when the road into town was impassable, and they were alone at the ranch with their stores and each other and the howling white world outside. And Nathan would not let her do the outside work, and she would not entirely abide by this prohibition, because she was, as she had always been, a person of intense practicality, and there were things that needed doing. They argued about it. They argued for the first time in December, when she came in from helping with the barn in weather that Nathan had told her to stay out of, and his expression was so tight with a worry that looked like anger that she felt the old defensive armor want to come back up, and she let it start and then chose to put it down again. "I am capable," she said. "I am not made of glass. Women have worked through pregnancies in conditions considerably worse than this and come through fine." "I know that," he said through his teeth. "Then what is this about?" He was silent for a moment. Then quietly, "I am frightened. I am allowed to be frightened." She looked at him. All the armor went. "Yes," she said. "You are. I'm sorry. I should have considered that." "And I should consider," he said slowly, "that treating you like you're breakable is an insult to everything you are." They stood in the kitchen looking at each other, and then she crossed to him and put her arms around him, and he held her carefully, his hand against the round of her belly, and she felt the baby move a small, definitive motion, and she took his hand and pressed it to the place. He went entirely still. "There," she said. He stood holding that motion under his palm, and his face was a thing she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The awe in it, the vulnerability of a man confronted with something irreducible. "There," he said very softly. Their son was born on the 10th of February, 1881, during a pause in the weather delivered by the midwife from Caldwell who had ridden out through 2 feet of snow because that was her job, and she was a woman who did her job. He was healthy. He was loud from the first moment. He had Nathan's coloring, and, in Helen's opinion, Nathan's expression. That particular set of the jaw that suggested opinions were being formed about the quality of the current situation. They named him James Thomas Morgan. James for no particular reason except that it sounded sturdy, and Thomas because when Helen had suggested it, Nathan had gone quiet, and then looked at her with something in his eyes that was raw and grateful. The spring after James was born was the most beautiful Helen had yet seen in Kansas, and she had seen 2 springs now. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house on a morning in April 1881 with the baby in her arms and Nathan behind her with his hand on her shoulder. And she looked at the south field, the green coming in, the cattle moving through it, the creek bright in the distance, the sky doing its impossible blue thing. And she thought that she had once sat in a doorway on Calvert Street in Philadelphia and survived a night alone in the cold, and that she had once stood in the middle of Caldwell's general store and been told that the winters would test her, and that everything between those 2 moments had been the education of a life. She had been tested. She had passed. And what she had been given on the other side of the test was so much more than she had thought to ask for. Nathan said into her hair, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about a letter," she said. "The first letter you wrote me." "God," he said with feeling. "That was a terrible letter. I didn't know what I was doing." "It was a perfectly good letter," she said. "It was honest. It was awkward." "Honest and awkward," she said, "which is my favorite combination as it turns out." He laughed, and the baby startled and then settled, and Helen felt Nathan's arm come around her properly, his chin resting on top of her head, both of them looking out at the morning land. 2 years passed, and they were good years not without difficulty, because the land and the work and the weather never allowed for difficulty to entirely absent itself, but good in the way that things are good when they have been built on a genuine foundation. The ranch grew. They added a small bunkhouse and brought on a hand named Will Ferris, a quiet young man of 20 who was good with cattle and better with horses, and who ate at their table most evenings and became, gradually, part of the fabric of the place. They finished the back room of the house, finally, Nathan and Will working through 2 weekends in May of 1882, while Helen directed with the focused authority of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a finished house. Nathan started teaching Will to read in the evenings, by lamplight, with a patience that Helen found so quietly moving she had to find a reason to leave the room on several occasions. Nathan was not a demonstrative man in the broad sense. He did not make grand gestures, but he did things like this, quiet, consistent things, and she had come to know that they were his language. She told him this one night after Will had gone out to the bunkhouse and James was asleep and they were alone in the lamplight. "You teach through example," she said. "You teach what you know to people who need it and you do it without fuss." He looked at her. "I just teach him how to read," he said. "You're giving him a life," she said. "He'll be able to read a contract. He'll be able to read a land claim. He'll be able to read a letter to a woman in Philadelphia." Nathan's mouth did the sideways thing. "You're getting philosophical," he said. "I get philosophical in the evenings," she said. "You've noticed this." "I've noticed it," he said. "I've come to appreciate it most evenings." "Not all evenings. There was that night in December when you spent 40 minutes talking about whether land ownership is a moral construct. It was an interesting question. It was a cold night and I wanted to go to sleep." She laughed, and he pulled her toward him on the settee they had bought from a merchant who passed through Caldwell in the autumn, a luxury and a practical one. Nathan's back had opinions about the hard kitchen chairs after long days in the saddle, and she leaned against his shoulder in the lamplight, James asleep in the back room, the night quiet around them. "Nathan," she said, "I want to write to your mother." He was quiet for a moment. He had told her over the course of their years together about his mother, about her remarriage and their estrangement, not violent or complete, just the slow drift of a relationship that had never recovered from the weight of loss and departure. His mother lived in Memphis now with her second husband, and he wrote to her twice a year out of duty and received letters back that were dutiful in return. "Why?" he said. "Because she is James's grandmother," Helen said. "And because you are careful with her, which means you care about her, which means it would be good for both of you if there were more between you." She paused. "And because I think she would like to know that you are well and that you have a son named Thomas." He was very still for a moment. "James Thomas," he said. "She doesn't know that," Helen said. "Does she?" He exhaled slowly. "No," he said. I wasn't sure how to say it." "You don't have to say it," Helen said. "I can say it for you in a letter if you'd like." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the grass, a familiar sound by now, a sound she had come to associate with home. Finally he said, "Yes, I'd like that." She wrote the letter the following week. She was thorough and kind, and she told Nathan's mother, whose name was Margaret, as different from Helen's own mother's silence as one could imagine, because Nathan's mother wrote back within 3 weeks, about James Thomas and his tendency to wake at 5 in the morning with opinions, and about Nathan's garden, which had started as a practical thing and had become, over 2 summers, genuinely beautiful, and about the way the ranch looked in the autumn. The grass gone gold, and the sky that particular late-season color. Margaret Morgan wrote back 6 pages, which was 7 pages more than she had ever written to her son, and the letter was warm in the way of a woman who had been given permission to be warm and was making use of it. She asked about the baby's habits and Nathan's health, and whether Helen preferred spring or autumn, and said that she had been glad when she heard Nathan had married, because she had worried about him out there alone, and that she was glad beyond what she could easily say that the marriage was what it appeared to be. Nathan read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then folded it very carefully and put it in the box where he kept important papers, and he did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you," and Helen knew exactly what he meant. It was in the summer of 1883, with James now 2 years old and running at a pace that required constant attention, that Helen discovered she was pregnant again, and the discovery brought a particular joy that was different from the first time, less fraught with the newness of it, more grounded in the knowledge of what it meant and what it required, the full understanding of what a person was entering. This pregnancy was different from the first in small ways. She was more tired in the early months, and she had opinions about food that surprised even herself. And Nathan was different in the way he managed it, less anxious, more present in the particular steady way that was natural to him, bringing her tea in the evenings without being asked, and sitting with her on the porch in the long summer evenings when the heat broke and the sky went apricot and rose at the edges. It was on one of those evenings that she told him the thing she had never told him, the thing she had kept back, the piece of her history that lived in the darkest part of her. She had been 16 years old. She told him about the man, a distant relation of the family, a man who had stayed in their house for a month and who had put her in a position she could not get out of, and who had done things to her that she had spent years carefully not naming even to herself. She told him about how she had carried it for 8 years alone, without telling anyone, because there had been no one to tell, and because she had not trusted that the telling would be anything but another wound. She told him flat and plainly, the way she told hard things, looking out at the evening sky and not at him. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he reached over and took her hand, and he held it, and he said, "I'm glad you told me." "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I'm sorry for the hidden piece of it." "No," he said firmly. "You told me when you were ready. That's exactly right." He paused. "Helen, I want you to know what you built after that, who you are, The way you are, that is not in spite of what was done to you. It is not the outcome of it. It is entirely yours. You made yourself out of what you had, and you are the strongest person I have ever known." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were wet, and she was not someone who cried easily, not anymore, but this required it. "You are the only person I have ever fully trusted," she said. He moved across the porch and put his arms around her and held her there in the summer dusk, the cricket song starting up in the grass, James asleep inside, the new life beginning inside her and their life built around them, solid and real and made of tested things. "I've got you," he said. "I've always got you." Their daughter was born in February of 1884, on a winter night much gentler than the one that had brought James into the world. Nathan was there for the whole of it, which was not conventional but which the midwife permitted because Nathan was not the kind of man who could have stayed in another room, and because Helen wanted him. She was strong and uncomplaining and efficient even in her laboring, which the midwife said later was the most characteristic thing she had ever seen. They named her Clara, for the friend in Philadelphia who had handed Helen a newspaper clipping on a gray Tuesday morning, and accidentally changed the course of her life. Helen wrote to Clara, the real Clara, who had married a streetcar driver named George and had 2 children, and lived in the same neighborhood she had always lived in, to tell her about the name. Clara wrote back with such overwhelming delight that her letter was barely legible, saying that she was profoundly honored and also profoundly unsurprised, because she had known the moment Helen walked out of Philadelphia with that particular expression on her face that something significant was going to happen. The ranch in 1884 was a different thing from the 140 acres Nathan had described in his first careful letter. It was 210 acres now, expanded carefully over the years, the original parcel and a piece to the north that had come available 2 years ago. The herd was strong. Will Ferris had stayed, had become something close to family, eating at their table, playing with James on the weekends, holding baby Clara with the particular bewildered gentleness of a young man who had not been around small children before and was adapting rapidly. Will had learned to read and had begun, in the last months, to write letters to a young woman in Caldwell who worked at the dry goods store, letters which he would sometimes show to Helen for her opinion because he was not confident in his writing, and she had offered her help. "This part here," Helen said to him one evening, reading the latest draft at the kitchen table, James on the floor playing with a carved wooden horse Nathan had made him over the winter, Clara in her cradle near the stove, Nathan doing the accounts at the other end of the table. "Where you say she has a pleasant face, don't say that. Will look stricken. Is it wrong?" "It's not exactly wrong," Helen said carefully. "But pleasant face is the kind of thing you say about a distant acquaintance. What do you mean when you say it?" Will was quiet for a moment, thinking with the sincere concentration he brought to most things. "I mean," he said slowly, "that when she looks at me it makes me feel like the day got better." Helen looked at him. She looked at Nathan, who was looking at Will with the quiet amusement of a man watching a younger version of something. "Say that," Helen said. Will looked at the paper. He nodded. He crossed out pleasant face and wrote what he had said, and then read it back and seemed satisfied, and folded the letter. The girl's name was Nora Ellis, and she and Will were married the following spring, in the same church where Nathan and Helen had stood together 5 years earlier, and Nathan stood with Will and Helen stood with Nora and James, who was 4 now, and had his father's absolute dignity and his mother's complete lack of patience for nonsense, held Clara on his lap in the front pew with the focused expression of a small person taking a significant responsibility seriously. Caldwell in 1885 was a different town from the one Helen had arrived in. The railroad spur had come, not from Darby's scheme but through the legitimate expansion of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, and the town had grown to accommodate it new buildings, new businesses, new people. Helen knew most of them. She had become, over 5 years, a person of some standing in Caldwell County, not because she sought it, but because she was known as capable and fair, and because people tended to seek out those qualities in a place where both were in imperfect supply. She had helped, in the past 2 years, 3 women who came out to the territory as brides under circumstances that were less good than her own women, whose husbands turned out to be different from what they had represented, or who arrived to find nothing waiting for them, or who were simply stranded and frightened and alone. She helped them practically, found them places to stay, helped them find work. In one case, helped a woman named Mary Bauer navigate the question of what to do when the man she had come to marry turned out to already have a wife. Nathan had watched this work grow with the same expression he wore for most things he admired in her: quiet, warm, and slightly awed. He had said once that he thought she should stay out of the Bauer situation because it was complicated and could make enemies, and she had said that complicated things that needed doing were still things that needed doing, and that she was not going to leave a woman stranded because it was uncomfortable. He had thought about this and said, "You're right," which he said readily when he was wrong, which was one of the things she loved about him. She loved many things about him by this point. She loved the way he was with James, the patience of him, the seriousness with which he answered the boys' constant questions about everything from why the sky was blue to where horses went when they died. She loved the way he held Clara, who was a small, fierce person of fierce opinions, with the absolute ease of a man who had learned that small, fierce people have large interior lives that require respect. She loved that he had kept writing to his mother, and that the letters had grown over the years from dutiful to genuinely warm. She loved the way he still looked at her sometimes, across a room or a field, with the slightly stunned expression of a man who cannot quite account for his own luck. She told him all of this on the occasion of their 5th wedding anniversary, which she was inclined to celebrate with more ceremony than he thought strictly necessary. 5 years, she said. They were at the kitchen table after supper, James in bed, Clara in bed, the house quiet around them, and a jar of apple brandy on the table that Pete Driscoll had brought over the previous week. 5 years, Nathan said. He poured them both a measure of brandy and pushed hers across the table. "Do you remember the general store?" She said. "I remember," he said. "I was trying to push you away." "I know," she said. "Why exactly did you think telling me the winters would test me would push me away?" "I thought," he said carefully, "that you were like most people and that most people did not like to be told hard things directly. And when it didn't push me away, I was confused," he said with the deadpan dignity that was one of his finest qualities. "And then I was frightened. And then I was very glad." Helen laughed and picked up her brandy. "I was frightened too," she said, "not of the winters, of me, of wanting something," she said. "Of letting myself want something and finding out it wasn't, that the reality didn't hold up to what I had built in my mind over 7 months of letters." She paused. "But it did. The reality was better." Nathan looked at her across the table in the lamplight. This woman who had crossed half a continent to stand in a general store and refuse to be dismissed, who had helped him fight a water rights dispute and run a household in a blizzard, and navigate his own damaged history back to something whole and living. This woman who had told him the hard things about herself and trusted him with them. This woman who was brave in every sense of the word, but especially in the sense that mattered most, the willingness to remain present when presence was difficult. "Helen," he said. "Yes. I want to say something." "All right." He turned the brandy glass in his hands. He was a man who chose his words carefully and meant them exactly. "When I wrote that first letter," he said, "I was asking for something practical, a partnership. I didn't know, I had told myself I was not capable of what came after, that I had used up that capacity and it was gone." He paused. "And what I want you to know is that you did not restore something that was lost. It was not like that. It was not like finding something I had misplaced." Another pause. "It was like finding that I had been wrong about what I was capable of, that the capacity was there and had always been there and was waiting for the right person to make use of it." He looked at her directly. "You made use of it. Every day you make use of it. And I want you to know that I am grateful every single day that you were not afraid to." Helen's throat was tight. She held his gaze across the table, and she thought of the boarding house in Philadelphia, and the button factory, and the advertisement clipping in Clara's hand, and the 7 months of letters, and the stagecoach ride, and the moment she had stepped down into the dust of Caldwell and seen him waiting, and the long, complicated, real and tender road between that moment and this one. "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid every step of the way." "And you did it anyway," he said. "And I did it anyway," she said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat together in the warm kitchen on the night of their 5th anniversary, the apple brandy in the jar, the house quiet and full around them, the prairie wind doing its customary thing outside. And Helen thought that this was what she had come for, not exactly this, because she could not have imagined this precisely, but this fullness, this particular rightness. She thought of the winter. She thought of what the winter had asked of her, and what she had found she had to give it, and she thought that Nathan had been right in his way. The winters had tested her. Every winter had tested her, the cold ones and the metaphorical ones, the frozen pumps and the frank Darbys, and the nights of the blizzard when they worked side by side in the dark, and all the long inner winters of her life that had come before, that had tested her with isolation and silence and the small daily violences of a childhood without much warmth. She had been tested by all of them, and she had passed, not because she had been without fear or without doubt or without the human capacity to break, but because she had refused at every breaking point to stay broken. Because she had learned, somewhere in the hard years of her forming, that surviving was not enough and that building was possible, and that love, real love, the kind you build with your hands over years and winters, was not a thing you fell into but a thing you chose and kept choosing, even when it was frightening. Especially when it was frightening. She looked at Nathan across the kitchen table, his hand in hers, his gray-green eyes warm in the lamplight. She thought of James asleep in the back room and Clara in her cradle, and the spring coming and the fields greening and the long good years ahead. "Thank you for writing that first letter," she said. His mouth did the sideways thing, and then it became the full smile, the one that had appeared for the first time after the Darby incident and that she still found extraordinary. "Thank you for writing back," he said. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the winter-edge grass in the dark, a sound she knew by heart now, a sound that was hers and his and James's and Clara's and the ranches and the lands. A sound that meant home in a way that she had not understood home could mean anything at all before she came here. She had arrived afraid and alone and armored against everything. She was still afraid of some things. She was never alone. And the armor had become something different over 5 years. Not a wall built to keep things out, but a kind of steady internal courage. The courage of a woman who knew exactly what she was made of and what she could carry and what she chose to carry, freely and without compulsion, because she had decided that some things were worth the wait. He had told her the winters would test her. She had said she had already been tested and passed. What she had not said, what she had not yet known to say, was that the tests were not the thing. The tests were only the way the land and life asked you to prove yourself worthy of what was waiting on the other side. And what was on the other side was this: the lamp on the table, the brandy in the jar, the sleeping children in the warm house, the man across the table with the complicated eyes and the hard history and the heart he had, against everything, kept open enough to be found. Worth every winter, worth every one.